There's a sentence that shows up in almost every failed team, right before the ending. It sounds like this: the team just wasn't good enough. Not enough talent, not enough commitment, wrong people in the wrong roles. It's a comfortable sentence because it points outward, away from the one person actually standing at the front of that team. I've said a version of that sentence about my own body more times than I'd like to admit. Not out loud, usually, but in the quiet accounting I did after a bad run. A skipped week, another flare-up in the same knee that's been complaining on and off for years. The sentence never came out as I failed. It came out as this body just isn't built for this, which sounds like an observation but functions exactly like a verdict. Final, unappealable, nothing to do but accept it. Two men who spent years leading soldiers through the worst violence modern warfare has to offer eventually stop believing that sentence in any form from anyone. What they learned instead and wrote down in a book called Extreme Ownership was this: there's no such thing as a bad team, only a badly led one. Every time a unit underperformed, the actual cause, without exception, traced back up to leadership. Poor training. Standards that were stated but never enforced. A mission explained badly, or not explained at all. The team wasn't broken. The leadership above it was. I want to spend this whole episode on that one idea, because the moment I actually applied it to myself instead of to other people, it rearranged a lot of what I thought I understood about my own body and my own history of failed attempts. Here's where most people, myself included for a long time, get to skip past the hard part of this idea. It's easy to nod along when we're talking about a company or a sports team or a military unit, some other group of people led by someone else. It's much harder to apply to the one team you actually run every single day, the one made up entirely of you. Your body, your habits, your schedule, your gear, your recovery, all the moving parts that either work together or don't. That's your team. And exactly like any other team, when it underperforms, the honest first question isn't what's wrong with my team, it's what's wrong with how I've been leading it. Let me make this concrete, because abstractions are easy to agree with and easy to forget by the next paragraph. For years, I quietly believed my body was simply a bad team. Old injuries, slower recovery than I remember from my 20s, a knee that seemed to have opinions about mileage that no amount of willpower could override. I treated all of that as fixed information about who I was, the way you describe a teammate who just wasn't very talented and never would be. Nothing personal, just the reality of the roster I'd been handed. I can point to the exact week this started to crack open. I'd increased my weekly mileage by roughly a third in one jump because I felt strong and figured strong meant ready. Within 10 days, the same knee that had been fine for months flared up again, and my first reaction, the automatic one, was almost relief in a strange way. See, this confirms it. This knee just can't handle real training. Nothing I do will change that. It took actually sitting down and looking at the numbers, the jump in mileage, the complete absence of any strength work in the weeks leading up to it, the fact that I'd changed 3 variables at once instead of one, to see that the knee hadn't betrayed a fixed limitation. It had responded entirely predictably to a training decision that any reasonable coach would have flagged as reckless before it even happened. The knee wasn't the problem. The plan was. What actually happened, once I looked honestly, was closer to something else entirely. I had never trained that body the way you train an actual team, with a real plan, appropriate progression, deliberate recovery, honest feedback about what was working. I ran the same routes at the same effort level for years, then treated a growing list of injuries as proof of bad genetics, when a good deal of it was proof of bad leadership. No periodization, no strength work to support the joints doing all the work, no attention to sleep or nutrition beyond vague good intentions. My team wasn't bad. It had never really been led. That reframe changes the entire emotional shape of the problem. My body is bad at this is a life sentence. There's nothing to do with it except grieve it or ignore it. I haven't led my training well yet is a Tuesday problem. It has a next action. That's the whole value of moving the responsibility up the chain instead of down onto the team. The moment the cause sits with leadership, it also becomes fixable because leadership is the one part of this you actually have full authority over. There's a specific mechanism in the book worth pulling apart here because it explains exactly how a leader's failure quietly becomes a team's failure, and it applies almost perfectly to a body and a training history. The authors point to standards, not the standards a leader announces, the ones they actually enforce. A leader can say out loud that showing up on time matters, that quality matters, that no detail is too small to care about. But the real standard of that team is whatever the leader has demonstrated they'll tolerate without consequence. Say one thing, tolerate another, and the tolerated version is the actual standard, regardless of what got said in the meeting. Translate that to training, and it gets uncomfortably specific fast. You can tell yourself and anyone who asks that recovery matters to you, that you take your body's signal seriously, that consistency is the whole philosophy behind this channel. But the real standard isn't the sentence you say out loud. It's whatever you've actually tolerated, run after run, without changing anything. If you've quietly tolerated skipping stretching for 8 months, that's your real standard on stretching, whatever you tell people. If you've tolerated running through sharp pain because stopping felt like admitting failure, that's your real standard on listening to your body, no matter how many times you've said the opposite in an interview or a caption. The team, in this case your knees, your back, your recovery, was only ever following the standard that got enforced through repetition, not the one that got announced through good intentions. This is, I think, the single most useful diagnostic question this chapter hands you. Not what do I believe about my training, but what have I actually tolerated over and over without changing it? That second question doesn't lie, because it's built entirely out of what actually happened, not what you meant to happen. The same test works on almost anything you call a health habit rather than strictly a training one. I'll say, if you ask me directly, that eating well matters to me. But the honest standard, the one built from repetition rather than intention, was for a long time something closer to eating whatever's fastest after a run, regardless of what it actually gives the body that just worked hard. Nobody enforced a consequence for that gap between the stated belief and the tolerated pattern. So the tolerated pattern kept quietly winning, run after run, for longer than I'd like to admit. The team wasn't failing to recover well, because it was a bad team. It was following the only standard that had ever actually been enforced. There's a second failure mode the book describes that's just as relevant, and it's less about standards and more about explanation. A leader who gives an order without explaining the reason behind it gets compliance, at best, and usually not even that for long. A leader who explains the actual purpose, the real stakes, gets something closer to genuine buy-in, because the people executing the plan understand why it matters, not just that it's been assigned to them. Teams led by unexplained orders tend to quietly underperform, not out of rebellion, but because half-understood instructions get half-committed effort. Here's where this gets personal again, in a way I didn't expect the first time I sat with it. For years, my instructions to my own body were exactly this kind of unexplained order. Run further. Push through it. Do more, because more is what discipline looks like. I never actually explained the why to the parts of me that had to execute that order, mostly because I hadn't worked out the why for myself beyond a vague sense that discipline was supposed to hurt. Unsurprisingly, the execution was inconsistent, because the order itself was hollow. It wasn't until I could actually explain, honestly to myself, why a given week of training looked the way it did, what purpose the easy days served, what the hard days were actually building toward, that the follow-through got dramatically more consistent. Not because my willpower improved, because the orders finally had a reason attached to them. And a team, even a team of one, executes explained orders far better than unexplained ones. I've noticed the same gap in smaller orders too. Drink more water. Stretch before bed. Drink more water is an unexplained order. Drink water now because dehydration is a major, overlooked cause of the fatigue I blame on bad genetics is an explained one, and only the second version has ever actually changed my behavior for longer than a week. Sleep is probably the clearest example I have of an order I gave myself for years without ever really explaining it. Get more sleep sat on every list of good intentions I ever made, unexplained and unenforced for roughly a decade. What actually changed wasn't a stricter bedtime rule imposed from outside. It was connecting the specific mechanism. The mornings I felt least capable of leading myself, where the convenient excuse showed up fastest, were without exception the mornings following the worst sleep. Once that connection was explicit instead of vaguely assumed, sleep stopped being a background virtue and became a direct input into whether the leadership conversation with myself had a fair chance of going well. There's a piece of this the book spends real time on that goes beyond standards and explanation: training. A leader doesn't just set expectations and hope the team rises to meet them. A leader actually builds the skill and capacity needed to meet those expectations deliberately before the mission, not during it. A team that's never been properly trained isn't lacking in willingness when it fails. It's lacking in preparation that someone above them was responsible for providing. I have a second story here, less dramatic than the knee, but maybe more common. For a long stretch of years, I treated sleep and eating as background details, things that happened around my training rather than part of it. I'd stay up too late, eat whatever was convenient, and then get frustrated the next morning when my legs felt heavy and my motivation felt thin, as if that heaviness were some unrelated betrayal from a body that should have just performed regardless. It took an embarrassingly long time to see the actual structure of what was happening. I was sending an undertrained, underrested team out to execute a mission every morning and then quietly blaming the team when it struggled. The fix wasn't more willpower at 6 a.m. The fix was treating sleep and food as part of training, not as separate lifestyle choices happening off to the side of it, which meant leading that part of the team as deliberately as I eventually learned to lead the mileage itself. This is really the same idea as standards, just pointed at a different moment in the process. Standards are what you tolerate after the fact. Training is what you deliberately build before the fact, so the team actually has the capacity to meet the standard you're asking of it. A body asked to run 5 days a week without ever being taught gradually and deliberately how to recover, how to fuel, how to move well under fatigue isn't an undisciplined team. It's an undertrained one, and the responsibility for that training sits with exactly one person. There's a distinction worth being precise about here, because it's easy to blur training with simply doing more of the activity. Running more miles isn't the same as training the team that has to sustain those miles. A leader preparing a real team for a mission doesn't just send them out to repeat the same task more often and hope endurance appears. They build strength, teach technique, run drills on the specific weaknesses that showed up last time. The equivalent for a runner isn't just more running. It's the unglamorous supporting work. Strength training for the muscles that stabilize an aging joint. Mobility work for the specific tightness that keeps causing the same complaint. Deliberate easy days that actually stay easy instead of quietly turning into medium effort days out of impatience. None of that shows up as dramatically as another 5 miles on a tracker, which is probably exactly why it gets skipped first when time is short. But it's the part of training a leader is actually responsible for providing. And skipping it isn't a shortcut. It's sending an undertrained team out anyway and hoping this time is different. I want to offer a few different ways to actually use this idea this week, because people diagnose their own team problems differently depending on where the real gap is. If your gap looks like inconsistency, missed days, a training plan that quietly falls apart by week 3, the useful question is the standards one. What have I actually tolerated? Not what have I said I believe. Write down, honestly, the real pattern of the last month, not the intended one. That real pattern is your current leadership, whether you like the look of it or not, and it's the only accurate starting point for changing anything. If your gap looks more like plateaus or repeated injury despite showing up consistently, the more useful question is the training and explanation one. Has this body actually been led with a real plan, real progression, and a real reason behind each phase? Or has it been given the same unexplained order, run further on repeat for months or years? A team following an unexplained order eventually breaks down somewhere, and a body is no exception. If your gap looks like a body that seems to underperform no matter how consistent you are, the training question is the one worth sitting with. Has this team actually been trained deliberately in the parts of the job that make the running possible at all? Sleep, fuel, mobility, strength, or has all the deliberate effort gone into the mileage alone, while everything supporting that mileage ran on autopilot? A team can show up every day and still fail a mission it was never actually prepared for. And if your gap looks like something closer to burnout, resentment toward the whole project, dreading the run instead of wanting it, the question worth asking is whether the why ever actually got explained honestly in the first place, even to yourself, or whether you've been quietly following someone else's borrowed reason, a plan copied from a stranger online, a standard absorbed from comparison rather than built from your own actual purpose. None of these four questions is more correct than the others. They're diagnostic tools for different symptoms, and most people carry a mix of all four at different points, which is exactly why the book frames this as leadership rather than a single fixable flaw. Leadership is an ongoing practice, not a one-time repair. There's a boundary worth drawing clearly before I close this out, because no bad teams, only bad leaders can tip into something unhelpful if you take it in the wrong direction. This isn't a license for endless self-blame every time your body doesn't cooperate. Some physical limits are real, not stories, not excuses, just facts about a particular body at a particular age with a particular history. The idea isn't that better leadership erases every physical constraint. The idea is narrower and more useful than that. Whatever the real constraints are, the quality of leadership still determines how well you work within them, how much of the available room gets used, and how much gets left on the table because nobody was actually steering. Two people with the exact same knee injury can have completely different outcomes over the following year, and the difference is rarely raw willpower. It's almost always the quality of leadership applied to the same set of real constraints. If you're listening to this already several months into consistent training, already past the stage where the question is simply will I show up, this chapter still has something for you, just aimed slightly differently. Leaders who only ever lead themselves eventually reach a ceiling that individual effort alone can't clear. The book's answer for a real team is to develop leaders underneath the leader, so the whole organization gets stronger, not just the one person at the top. There's a version of that available to you even without an actual team. The people around you who are watching what you're building, quietly or openly, whether that's someone in your own house, a friend who's mentioned wanting to start, or a stranger in the comments who says this is the first time they've thought this might be possible for them too. Leading well enough that someone else starts leading themselves is the closest thing available to developing leaders underneath you when your team started as one person in a forest. I'd add one practical note to that. You don't develop those leaders by giving advice from a position of having it all solved. You develop them by being specific and honest about where your own standards slipped and what you actually changed, rather than a polished version with the messy part edited out. The people watching don't need a finished leader. They need to see what becoming one actually looks like from the inside, including the parts where the team, meaning you, clearly wasn't the problem and the leadership was. So here's the practice for this week, built around this one idea instead of scattered across 5. Pick one specific pattern in your training you've been quietly tolerating without ever officially deciding to. Not 5 patterns. 1. Name it precisely, not I should recover better in general, but the actual specific thing. I've skipped every cool down for 2 months, or I've run through ankle pain 3 times this month without addressing it, or I've followed the exact same route and pace for a year with no plan to change either. Once you've named it precisely, Ask the leadership question instead of the character question. Not, why am I so undisciplined about this, but what standard have I actually been enforcing here through repetition, regardless of what I've said I believe. Then decide, as the leader of this particular team, what the new standard is going to be, specifically enough that there's no ambiguity about whether you followed it tomorrow. Give that new standard an explanation too, the same way a good order gets explained instead of just issued. Not stretch for 5 minutes because you should, but the actual reason. Stretch for 5 minutes because tight calves have been the first domino in every shin problem you've had for the last 2 years. And this is the specific mechanism you're intervening on, not a generic wellness gesture. An explained standard survives contact with a tired, unmotivated version of you far better than an unexplained one. For exactly the same reason, a soldier who understands the mission holds the line better than one who was just told to stand there. Then write both things down somewhere you'll actually see again tomorrow. The specific pattern you're changing and the specific new standard replacing it, along with its one-sentence reason. Not a full training overhaul. One pattern clearly diagnosed, one new standard clearly explained. Everything else about your training can stay exactly as it is this week. Leadership doesn't require fixing everything simultaneously. It requires actually finishing the fix on the one thing you started. Tomorrow morning, it will still be dark when you tie your shoes. The knees, the back, the tired legs, they're not the team that failed you on the mornings you didn't show up. They were only ever waiting for someone to actually lead them somewhere on purpose. That's a strange kind of relief once it actually lands. Not because it makes the work disappear, but because it moves the whole problem from a place with no exit, a fixed verdict about a fixed body, into a place with an exit, a leadership gap with the next action attached to it. One is a wall. The other is just Tuesday's task list. I'll see you on the trail tomorrow. Same time, same choice. This is Run to Evolve. One day, one run, one lesson, no excuses.